Hello and welcome to the Budget Roundtable. The countdown has begun to Budget 2022. A budget taking place amidst an Omicron wave, a slowing global economy, rising inflation, volatile markets, and yes, an election season too in India. What then are the key challenges that face the Modi government and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman ahead of Budget 2022, and what are the possible solutions? That's the focus on this special Budget Roundtable. Joining us now is Senior Economist Dr. Ajit Ranade. I'm also joined by Nilesh Shah, Group President and MD Kotak Mahindra, and also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Professor Arun Kumar, a Senior Economist and author who's been a fierce critic of the Modi government's economic policies, and Siddharth Zarabi, Managing Editor, Business Today TV. We're going to be looking at all the challenges facing the government ahead of Budget 2022 in a moment. But before we begin to look at that, just take a look at just why this budget that comes bang in the middle of 5 state elections, including the politically crucial Uttar Pradesh, will be looked at so carefully this time.
The world is still reeling from the financial impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Right when India reached pre-pandemic levels, the Omicron wave struck, prompting the IMF to slash growth projections for the country by 0.5% to 9% for the year 2021-22. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will be presenting the booster budget on February at a time when a global crisis is looming. The IMF in its World Economic Outlook report has listed several threats to global economy: rising energy prices, supply chain disruptions, higher global inflation, meltdown in China's real estate sector, and slower recovery in private consumption are some of them.
There is a lot of volatility, etc., which will require the government and the RBI to kind of be very active at managing the situation as it arises. But apart from that, I do think despite all these challenges, a growth rate of 7.5% to 8% is, of course, quite possible and very likely.
Public investment appears to remain the key till the economy recovers from the pandemic shock.
Fiscal policy should stay accommodative for another year. They have kept it accommodative for the last year too, so I would say keep it accommodative for the next year, just given the fact that this is still an ongoing recovery and much more ground has to be covered. Within the envelope, I would say that you should focus on having a more inclusive recovery.
This is not the only concern surrounding India's economic growth. A recent study shows the annual household income of the poorest 20% has come down by over 52% in 2020-21 compared with 2015-16. The income of lower middle class has come down by over 30% during the same period. The middle income group's income is down nearly 9%. These income groups are critical to raising consumption.
The government has to have a supportive fiscal policy. It should not be in a hurry to come back to process of sharp fiscal consolidation, and they should provide some sort of support to the growth.
The booster budget also comes in the middle of the very crucial 5 state elections, which also includes the politically crucial state of Uttar Pradesh. There's a possibility that we could see populist measures in the upcoming budgets, but the idea is to keep the growth trajectory on and to create more jobs. This is Shwara Paliwal reporting for India Today with camera person Parmendi Sharma.
Okay, then it's time to look at the challenges facing Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman with our roundtable panel. The first one that I'm flagging off is how do you revive consumer sentiment and demand creation, and in a way kickstart the growth momentum in the economy. Nilesh Shah, you're with the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Is that really the big challenge? How do you revive in these pandemic times consumer sentiment and kickstart demand?
Undoubtedly, today in our economy, consumption is below pre-pandemic level. Trade, investments, government spending in agriculture are above pre-pandemic level. Now, there are 2 ways to revive consumption. One, using English proverb, either you give him a fish or you teach him a fishing. And I think both options should be exercised. We have seen Manrega creating employment in rural India, supporting consumption, and if used well, also creating infrastructure. Probably time has come to launch Urban Manrega, which can especially support pandemic-impacted sectors like hotels and restaurants, school bus operators and teachers, hotels and tourism and travel kind of sector. The second thing is related to, teaching fishing, which is essentially creating employment. Two sectors which employ maximum number of Indians are housing, real estate, and textiles. If we can create an incentive scheme for first-time buyers or give more concession for interest on housing loan and principal repayment, that will not only support housing and construction industry, but also leave more money in the hands of taxpayers who will spend it on consumption. In textiles, we have been big player on cotton growing or man-made fibers, spinning and weaving. But the maximum value at which happens on garmenting, a Bangladesh or a Vietnam is way ahead of us. How do we incentivize through fiscal or other measures so that garmenting industry can take off? That will create employment, especially at the bottom of the pyramid. And this kind of steps together can support consumption.
Interesting. You're giving us solutions, including Urban Manrega, which has been spoken about for a while, that you need an urban employment guarantee scheme. Professor Arun Kumar, you heard someone who's associated with the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council accepting in a way that you need to kickstart consumer demand. Where would you start? Would you support, for example, urban employment scheme?
Of course, that's been one of my key recommendations for the last 2 years, that we need that, because you see, even though the official data says that consumption has come back to more or less the level that was there in 2019, just a little bit lower, but this does not include the unorganized sector. And yesterday we had this report that showed that the bottom 60% have lost incomes as compared to 2015-16. Especially the bottom 20% have lost like half the income. So, there's a huge problem of incomes and therefore of demand, especially in the unorganized sector, and that doesn't get captured in our official data. So we do need to increase rural employment. We do need to increase the wages there. We have only 100 days of work available, and according to data, perhaps only 50 days of work is available. So that needs to be at least increased to 100 days. So that would imply that we need to maybe triple our allocation to the rural employment guarantee scheme. And then, we need to structure an urban employment guarantee scheme where education, health, and infrastructure should be the focus. That would generate a lot of jobs because, education, health do employ a lot of people. They are, people intensive rather than capital intensive. So those two would be very good. I would also say we need to support the micro sector. We lump all our policies into MSME, and the small and medium get the benefit, not the micro sector. The micro sector is 99% of the MSME sector and employs 97.5% of the MSME employment. Now, unless that sector revives, our employment generation would not revive, incomes would not revive. So though 5 kilogram of ration is being given to the poor people, but that's inadequate, as the National Health and Family Welfare Survey shows that there is a lot of malnourishment and undernourishment and stunting there, which means that in spite of these schemes, people are still not able to consume enough. And not only that, they have other demands as well, which are not fulfilled. So therefore, the micro sector needs to be taken care of. There, the availability of credit is very important. Unfortunately, what happens is when we declare policies for MSME, then the small and medium get the benefit, but not the micros. Therefore, specially targeted scheme for the micro sector, that would be very essential if we need to revive demand. The question always is raised is how are we going to raise resources for this kind of a program, because it would require very substantial amount of resources to be allocated to these, which have not been done in the past. So that would be the next challenge that would come, that either the deficit would rise or you would need to raise fresh resources through taxation. But you cannot raise resources through taxation of indirect tax kind, because that would be inflationary and that would further create problems of demand. So therefore, the burden would have to fall either on raising the fiscal deficit, which the government would not like, or the direct taxes, which the well-off sections may not like. So the government has a very tough choice how to boost demand in the present system. And as Mr. Shah has correctly pointed out, that at this point of time, government seems to be the best bet for raising demand. The export sector also is not likely to raise demand because our imports are running much higher than the exports, which means that there is a deflationary impact of that on the economy because the trade deficit is rising, the current account deficit is quite high. So therefore, ultimately, the burden would be on public investment and improvement in private consumption through
I'll come to some of those issues later. But, I just want to for now focus on immediately what is the main challenge, which is sort of stimulating demand in what has been otherwise a depressed economy for 2 years. Dr. Ranade, there's talk of cash transfers. There's talk of, ensuring that there is money put in the hands of those who need it most at the moment. There's the inequality index that's been talked about so much, and I want to put that also up here as a major challenge, the rising inequality, wherein those at the bottom 20 percentile, according to recent reports, are the ones who've been hurt the most in these pandemic years. Do you feel some kind of direct cash transfer scheme is needed now?
Yes, Rajdeep, the main driver of growth is consumer spending, and the consumers consist of high income and low income people, but the bulk of the population is middle income or low income. And the survey that you mentioned, the ICE 360 survey, shows that the bottom 20% has suffered an income loss of 53%, whereas the upper quartile or upper decile has gained income by 39%. So that is what we are looking at. We are looking at a very sharp K-shaped recovery where the upper part of the K, which is corporate results, are good. The upper end of the income spectrum, they are doing better. The stock market has done relatively better. But the bulk of the population is on the lower part of the K, which is the informal sector, the micro and small and medium enterprises and large masses. So if you want to revive consumer spending across the economy, you will have to pay attention to the lower incomes, which means that the stimulus that you want to provide has to be in some form of, like I think Jaswant Singh, former Finance Minister, used to say, putting purchasing power in the pockets of the people. Now, the best way is, of course, through jobs. If jobs can be generated, then they lead to incomes. But while we wait for job generation, and jobs tend to be a lagging indicator, you need to find some immediate solutions. So when you said cash transfer, Rajdeep, one idea that has been mooted for quite some time is in the form of consumption vouchers. So these also stimulate the local economy. So these vouchers are very carefully designed. They've been tried in other countries like Taiwan. They have an expiry date. They're purely digital, and they're targeted towards specific services like local repairmen, local kirana shops, local grocery stores. And they can be directly transferred into people's mobile phones, and the people use that to purchase local goods and services. So that is one thing I think worth trying, consumers consumption stimulus. The other thing, of course, that you mentioned is the urban job guarantee scheme. But I think it as a concept, it is attractive, but to implement it, it will be quite a big challenge. Unlike rural areas where the project site is near the village, so the commuting time is, it's just within a couple of kilometers. Secondly, the jobs tend to be lower skilled, semi-skilled. Whereas in city urban settings, people might have to commute longer distances. The jobs could be a little more complex and require skills. So it's not going to be easy to implement a jobs guarantee scheme in urban areas. In fact, no less than the chairman of Hindustan Lever has asked for it. So this has been talked about for some time. But I think a consumption voucher has a better chance. And of course, then we have DBTs too. I mean, the PM Kisan program, it puts money directly into the household budgets of farmer households. Something similar can be tried for the large informal sector in urban settings too. That is direct benefit transfer.
All of this needs resources. Siddharth Zarabi, there will be, the challenge is resource mobilization. How do you, if you are to bring in some of these suggestions that are being already put forward by our eminent guests, how do you actually raise resources? I've heard talk of a wealth tax. some way of taxing. How do you tax people in, at the top of the pyramid in a way? When you also want to stimulate private investment, you want to kickstart the economy, surely you can't sort of add to taxations at a time like this.
Given how tax collections have performed so far this year, both on the direct and the indirect side, this has been a very robust year as far as tax revenues are concerned. If you were to add some disinvestment revenues, I would say the government will overshoot expectations there. However, that tells us that one, instead of a further increase, it would make eminent sense from a consumption point of view and from a political economy point of view, Rajdeep, to look at some further relaxations, particularly for the tax-paying middle class. The corporates of the country got a big tax cut in September 2019. The middle class is waiting for it. The non-tax-paying class, which gets a lot of the subsidy bill, will perhaps look at more further subsidies. I just want to give you one quick number. Last year, which was the previous financial year, the actual social subsidy bill was 6,50,000 crore. I am rounding off figures. Current year's budget had projected at 3,70,000 crore. I believe because of the extra spending, it will perhaps close at 5,50,000 crore. What does that tell you? The spending from the previous financial year to the current financial year on social sector subsidies, fertilizer, food and everything will be 1 lakh crore lesser. In summation, I expect this budget to do a balancing act, further reduce the fiscal deficit, and I perhaps don't see any new schemes, perhaps redirection, yes, but no new schemes happening, Rajdeep.
Let's look at specifically the immediate challenges that are faced. This is a budget, as we've been saying, which is going to be brought in at a time when inflation is a concern, not just in India, but across the world. Nilesh Shah, in that sense, do you believe that the finance minister is constrained by the concerns of the challenges being posed increasingly by inflationary pressures and supply chain disruptions?
Supply chain disruptions, undoubtedly. But inflationary pressure in India is still well within RBI's target range. For 6 months in running, US inflation is higher than India. That has rarely happened. And from a resource point of view, what Siddharth mentioned, there is multiple ways of raising resources. Asset monetization is one way. Today, the banking system and government liquidity is more than 10.5 lakh crore. And if we can put some of the government assets like roads, highways into REIT or investment trust and put it into market, I'm sure out of that 10.5 lakh crore liquidity, a lot of money can shift to those instruments. Global investors, despite rising interest rates, will be interested in investing in Indian REITs and InvITs as it offers them long-term interest rate, long-term returns. So asset monetization is one way to raise resources. And as I mentioned, there is 10.5 lakh crore liquidity lying in India's banking and government system. The second thing is divestment. No matter what kind of market is there, in last 20 years, we have never achieved our divestment targets. Maybe it is time to reinvent the wheel. A holding company structure like GIC or Temasek, where professional managers manage government's non-core holding and look for strategic or market divestment, will ensure that at least we start achieving our divestment targets. And if we get better valuation, that will be added bonus. Along with corporate tax collection, personal income tax collection, plus asset monetization, plus divestment, we should be able to raise resources which are necessary for supporting consumption.
Okay, let's turn though to what is being described as an uneven recovery so far. While we had a contraction in 2021, there were signs, particularly in the first 2 quarters, of a recovery, but it's uneven. And now we've got an Omicron wave as well. The fear is service sector, hospitality, certain sectors have been particularly badly hit. Professor Arun Kumar, you mentioned micro enterprises, informal sector badly hit. Given that this is this W-shaped, as they are now calling it, uneven recovery, what's the solution?
So, recovery would require that we support the economy, especially as we were discussing in the first part, increase demand. If we are unable to increase demand, then investment is not going to rise, and capacity utilization was below 70% as per the RBI data, and that is only the organized sector capacity utilization. So even the organized sector was not fully recovered from the pre-pandemic level, and the consumer sentiment was very low. The figures that came last were about 55 as compared to 105 when in the pre-pandemic, January 2020. So we have to raise consumer sentiment as well as capacity utilization for the economy to recover. Now, that would require, as we discussed in the earlier part, a boost in the purchasing power at the lower levels. So that has to be the priority rather than anything else. Now, how do we do that? And that's why I was saying that we need to raise resources to transfer funds there. There we have to admit that the direct taxes are paid effectively by 15 million people, as the Prime Minister himself said. So in a country of 1.4 billion, if 15 million are effective taxpayers, then giving tax concession is not going to boost consumption. The middle class, that is rather the lower middle class or the middle class, is not really paying very much tax. So any concession there will be only a minor thing. So that's why, we've been talking about employment generation as the key, so that brings in the lower segments also back up into the demand calculus. They are the ones who are losing out. They are the ones who have gone down.
So you're suggesting some kind of a tax hike, is it?
Yes. So I'm suggesting that, we have to raise direct taxes from those who've done very well in the last 2 years, whether because of the increase in their wealth, because of the stock market, or because of other reasons, because the organized sector has done well, because the unorganized sector demand has shifted there. So the corporate profits, as per the RBI survey, have been rising at 22%. That means the pricing power of the corporate sector has improved. So in spite of the cost increases, they have raised prices and they've been able to generate more profit as a result of the thing. So that's where I think the taxation has to come in and raise resources.
You've raised the contentious issue, Siddharth. You wanted to respond to that. You don't agree with this at all?
No, I think approaching it from a ideological perspective, that because corporates are making more profits, that's why they should be taxed, I won't agree with that. I think tax breaks are given to stimulate consumption, and Professor Kumar would agree with me, consumption happens with those who have some surplus income. So if the argument is to increase consumption, we perhaps need to give those people a break, sir. For example, for last 3 years, everyone's health expenditure has gone up. You have not a single rupees break to those people. Instead, you have health insurance premiums every year being taxed at an absurd service tax rate. How do you justify that?
So how would you resolve that? You're saying that the middle class is the one that needs...
Farm sector reforms have been lost for the time being, so let's forget taxing agriculture income. I'm not even bringing that up. I think there is clear-cut logic to rationalize GST also, which is outside the budget, and look at a fairer direct tax regime where corporates did get a big break in September 2019, and now the middle class, the tax-paying class, needs some relief. It's 3 years of the pandemic.
What? Give me an example.
Why not? Give
on
them
health expenditure?
Give them a greater set-off. Please allow for greater allowances when it comes to even work-from-home expenditure on digital. Everybody is paying more for bandwidth. Give people that ability to have some surplus income which they can save and spend. You cannot keep taxing. As far as corporates is concerned and the market argument, this year perhaps the market collection for next year, I believe that the target will be enhanced to at least 25,000 crore because volumes are up. So my limited point is that we cannot approach it from an ideological perspective. We have to look at the rational ability of people to pay. Who else do you tax then?
Let Dr. Ranade respond for a moment. You want to dive into this debate about where, how do you provide relief to the middle class? Do you tax those who apparently, according to Professor Arun Kumar, have benefited the most in the last 2 years?
Rajdeep, can I just clarify what I said?
Yes, very quickly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. As I said, the Prime Minister himself said that 15 million people are effective direct taxpayers. The rest either pay very little tax or, zero tax in their, returns that they file. So if you give a tax concession at this point in income tax, that'll go basically to the well-off sections who already are making a lot of income. Hardly, very little will go to the middle classes where you want to boost, and hardly anything will go to the lower classes. So lower classes will benefit only if the indirect taxes are reduced or you put money in their hand.
You're
So
talking
I
about
think,
taxing those right at the very top. Let Dr. Ranade respond.
Rajdeep, the per capita income of India is about 1.4 lakh rupees. That's per man, woman, or child. And we start taxing incomes only from 6 lakh rupees. That is more than 400%, 4 times bigger than the per capita income. Nowhere else in the world, for example, a country like USA, the per capita income per man, woman, and child in USA is $50,000. They start paying taxes when you start earning an income of $10,000. Nowhere else in the world do we have a situation where you get such very high threshold exemptions of direct taxes. But then that compounds into the problem of what Professor Arun Kumar said, that basically India has a challenge of a low tax to GDP ratio. In India, for every 100 voters, we have only 7 taxpayers. But that is direct income tax. You see, Mr. Zarabi said about agricultural income, only 14% of national income comes from agriculture. And 86% of agricultural holdings are micro, very small farms of less than 2 acres. So even if you started taxing agricultural income, you will barely get 1 or 2% of GDP increment. We need to push our tax to GDP ratio from 10%, which is very low today, to something like 15%. And therefore, we need to look at, of course, but don't forget, half of GDP is not in the GST tax net. So the big one is actually expanding the tax net of GST, because it may be true that very few people pay direct income taxes, that is as a fraction of total population, but almost everybody pays GST. When even a poor person buys soap or oil or biscuits, they pay GST. And the GST rate is too high, is 18%, the median rate. We need to find a way to bring down the GST rate to maybe 12%, as recommended by the original Kelkar committee, or even by Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam. He said 14%. And we need to find a way to expand the GDP tax, the tax net under GST to more than what it is right now. It's hardly 30-40%. Okay. That's the way we need to go. We need to increase India's tax to GDP rate, and it needs to be a combination of lowering the GST rate. But that's, of course, in the domain of the GST Council. It's not directly under the control of the Finance Minister.
Right.
In the meantime, of course, we have done well in capturing capital gains. We have done well in capturing dividend income. And that's the way to go. As you have more and more triangulation on, electronic and electronic linkage of all payments, I think we've done well. Incidentally, on corporate taxes, just quickly,
yes,
Siddharth Zarabi said that he's again. See, ultimately, income is earned by human beings, not by corporations. So when a corporate makes profit, that translates into dividend income or capital gains for human beings. If there's a way to get to that income electronically, which is what we have been doing in the last few years, we've actually managed to. The reason we are able to now tax dividends is because the TDS can be tracked at the company level. So I think that's the right direction to go. But let's not forget that we need to widen the GST tax net. That's very, very important.
Let's turn to reviving MSMEs. It's spoken of all the time. The government has announced various packages in COVID times for MSMEs, but they are still hurting. The pain is heavy. Many have closed down in specific sectors in particular. Nilesh Shah, is there a recognition? How do you address those, as I said, who are the ones who are hurt the most? I think that really is a priority of any of a budget in pandemic times. Trying to address the concerns of the fact that, as a recent report suggested, almost 84% of people have suffered some income loss or the other in the last 2 years.
So the MSME have been given ECLS, the Emergency Credit Guarantee Scheme. But the real challenge for MSME is the equity. And within MSME, there are micro SMEs, and then there are very few MSMEs. How do we provide equity capital to them? Today, our IPO market is meant for large companies. MSMEs or micro SMEs are not able to participate into capital raise in market. So maybe one way is to create an equity fund which can provide equity capital to MSMEs. The second thing is skilling and competitiveness and productivity. Today, what we have understood based on some of the NGOs where we work, that they are not able to scale up because of the compliance burden, regulation burden. We did some study in a place like Pune, where supply from home for food could not be scaled up because of various license which you have to take when you move on a commercial basis. Now, can we reduce the compliance burden so that these businesses can be scaled up? Can we give them appropriate skilling so that they can be more productive, more competitive? I think MSME requires multiple approaches. There is no one standard solution. But from a financial point of view, providing equity capital will help them, survive the downturn and also be better geared so that they can take advantage when the upturn comes.
Professor Arun Kumar, you had suggested right at the outset of the program targeting the micro enterprises. You believe that they should be the focus of the finance minister's attempt to revive the micro enterprises above all else. Am I correct?
Yes. So what I would say is that, we have to take immediate steps. Equity and skilling, etc., will be more long-term steps. But the micro sector is failing at the moment. And therefore, how do we revive that? That is the main thing. And what they need is working capital. So working capital provision has to be done, just like, there was a scheme to give 10,000 rupees to the Redi Patri Walas, something like that has to be there. Because without that, they are not going to be able to revive. If they don't have working capital, they cannot employ people, they cannot buy raw material, and therefore they cannot resume work. Second thing is, demand is shifting from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. Like, for instance, in retail sector, the e-commerce is booming, so the local stores, they have seen a declining business. So how do we shore them up so that this demand shift that is taking place, that they can cope with? Now it's going to be very difficult because the e-commerce sector is highly mechanized. So the number of people employed in e-commerce will be much less than what would be employed in the local stores. And that is where we need to generate some alternative for them. How do we do that? That's the second thing. The third thing is that our micro sector faces three problems. One is working capital, the second is technology, and the third is marketing. Now, that will be more of a medium-term solution. How do we provide them with the marketing and with the finance and the technology? For that, we need to begin to move in this budget. But immediate support to the micro sector in terms of working capital and in terms of alternative ways that they can continue to function in spite of the fact that the organized sector is encroaching on their sphere of operation.
Okay, let's turn to private investment, which we briefly referred to earlier. Among the four major drivers of the economy, exports doing reasonably well, public investments functioning well, but private investment and consumption. Siddharth Zarabi, what will it take in pandemic times to increase private investment?
I think private investment is clearly going to look at how consumption is growing and what the government is doing to support the consumption drive. There is a lot of capacity which is idle. I mean, you could go through several sectors and we see it around us, including the real estate sector, commercial real estate, for example, which has now been hit by work from home. So one budget won't be able to do it. I think the larger focus has to remain where you started, Rajdeep, that as long as you have people going out, spending, buying, and therefore paying much higher indirect taxes than the direct taxes, you will see a revival, and companies respond to future demand by investing today to cater to that demand. Look at, for example, what has happened in the electric vehicle segment. A lot of investment has gone there versus other traditional forms of mobility. And clearly, that is the growth sector that we will see. So I think the companies will respond to how consumption is picking up. We have to drive consumption, and that is the single biggest factor that will also work politically, Rajdeep, and I don't have to tell you this, before 2023, which will be the last full budget of this government before the next election, sir.
This election is, of course, this budget is coming in the shadow of elections, and that puts its own pressures on any government. But there's so much of talk of Atmanirbhar Bharat, and one is worried that a lot of this is being reduced to slogans. It really means very little on the ground. Some fear it leads only to protectionism and not really the way to sort of kickstart an economy and take it to the next level. Dr. Ranade, do you believe time has come, less sloganeering, less coinage of these words, and more a greater attempt to try and translate what government intends to do into practical realities on the ground. Atmanirbhar Bharat seems to be a nice word, which has been coined, but it seems to mean less and less on the ground.
Well, Rajdeep, one translation of that, see, Atmanirbhar doesn't mean import substitution. You don't raise import barriers and protect domestic industry. Atmanirbhar simply means that you develop domestic capabilities to be globally competitive.
But that hasn't happened. But you've actually gone the other. There has been an element of some of the bad practices of the past in some of these industries, which almost seem like import substitution.
But let's look at specific sectors which have been covered by the PLI scheme, the production-linked incentives. Now, there is a cluster approach to textiles, which was announced last year. So what has happened is, in our country, the fiber and the yarn and the fabric and the garmenting, which Nilesh also referred to, they travel all over the country with almost 3,000 kilometers and then defeat the competitiveness. If you have all of them in a clustered area, textile cluster, that increases their competitiveness tremendously. So we are trying that with textiles, we are trying that with specialty steels, we are trying that with some category of metal. So I think PLI is one approach, which is an industrial policy approach, where specific targets have been given, and if you achieve those targets, you get an incentive payment for the scheme, and it's got a sunset clause of 5 years. Remember that the software industry took off because of Section 10A, 10B, and it lasted for 10 years. And that got India a global reputation in software. So some of that industrial policy can be tried out in PLI, but specific sectors. The danger is that we should not become protectionist. We should not give PLI sectors protection in the form of import barriers. I think that's very important to remember. But I believe, by the way, on Siddharth Zarabi's point, because of this twin balance sheet problem is behind us, both banking balance sheet and corporate balance sheets are much better than what they were 3-4 years ago. I believe we are going to see a capex momentum building up this year because capacity utilization numbers have been going up. Corporates have done very well on profitability, so they have funding for new investment, capex, and banks are in a better position to give out loans. So I believe we are going to see some capex momentum in this year. Private investment.
Nilesh, you want to take forward the point I raised about, when you have a concept like Atmanirbhar Bharat, but you need to ensure that specific industries become more competitive. We've had Bangladesh and Vietnam, for example, in specific sectors, textile being one example, that have marched ahead. And now we are playing catch up in some of those sectors. So we need to translate some of these slogans into, genuine competitive advantage on the ground.
So I'll give you a template of two industries where Atmanirbhar Bharat has worked out. In 2015, we imported $8 billion worth of mobile phones. There were 3 mobile handset manufacturing plants in India, generating turnover of about 18,000 crore. We created 100% FDI, automatic route, single window clearance. We created electronic clusters like Ajit mentioned on textile clusters. We created phased manufacturing program, production-linked incentive scheme, and we give tax cut. Fast forward to 2021, our mobile manufacturing value will be 220,000 crore. We will be exporting $5 billion worth of mobile. Both Samsung and Apple, 2 large brands, are present in India through their manufacturers. They have achieved almost 100% more than their target for FY22 on mobile handsets. And the world's single largest location mobile handset plant is operated by Samsung in Noida, Uttar Pradesh, making about 6 crore mobile handsets, which will go to 12 crore mobile handsets. Over there, we also provided import duty protection, just like 10A, 10B provided incentive to IT industry in early 2000.
Right.
So this is one template which has worked where seamlessly central government, state government, local government came together. They encourage handset manufacturers, give them a red carpet. We then now are bringing in component makers. Our value addition in mobile is about 15-20%, but with component makers coming, scale coming, it will go to 30-40% over next 2-3 years. And if we are lucky, and semiconductor chips manufacturing happens in India, which is a long call. It may not happen, it may happen. But if that happens, then our value add could be even 50-60%. So what we have achieved on mobile handsets, from being net importer to net exporter, and from having negligible market share in global production to becoming 5% on the way to probably becoming 15%. from being 12th largest manufacturer of mobile handsets to become second largest mobile handset manufacturer. This is the template which we have to copy across various sectors. And as Ajit mentioned, we have to use these incentives and protection in a very, very short period of time to make our industry competitive. You put a fence for a podha, you don't put it for a tree. So you just nurture a small plant for a while so that it can grow into a big tree. We can't become protectionist for sure.
Okay, let's turn to a concern that any government has, and particularly in pandemic times is perhaps top of the mind, job creation. And I talk of quality jobs, not just jobs, but how are you going to create jobs that are productive is a huge challenge. Large numbers of jobs lost in pandemic, various figures are thrown, but Professor Arun Kumar, I know this has been one of your concerns. How do you address the concern?
So, what I have been arguing is that the loss of work is more than the loss of employment, because many people were still on the rolls, but they were not working. So therefore, the impact on the GDP was much greater. Now, to create quality jobs, you require investment. And that requires demand, which goes back to what we were discussing earlier. Mm-hmm. And this Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme and the earlier point that you raised about how to raise investment, both of them are relevant to the point that you're raising now. Unless public investment is raised, there will be no crowding in of private investment either, because demand is weak. So at this point of time, public investment has to be raised. And where would you raise public investment? As I said earlier, in education and health, because they'll employ a lot of people, and in all kind of, minor schemes. You see, major schemes that we have, like, the freight corridor and the highways, etc., they are highly mechanized. They don't directly generate that much job. Indirectly, whatever they generate, the other schemes will also generate. So in effect, what you need to do is start a lot of small, local projects, etc. And that's where the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and the Urban Guarantee Scheme also will tie in. Right. And the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme, which is, as Nilesh and others, Ajit have said, that will kickstart only some specific industries, but that will not necessarily mean across the board increase in employment generation. Okay. So what we require today is across the board quality job generation, and that has to come in a very decentralized manner, where the state governments will also play a very important role. So I think the state finances also have to be looked at, how the center would transfer funds to the states, where the states can then begin to generate, quality jobs as well. So it's a pretty complicated thing and completely interlinked with what you were discussing earlier.
Let me therefore give you a final word, Siddharth Zarabi. As someone who tracks the economy closely for years, where do you believe this budget will be judged on the basis of what? What is that key area that will determine in pandemic times, in an election season, that this budget has addressed the core concerns of our times?
I'm going to repeat what I said once earlier. This government, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, does not believe in instant coffee kind of budgets. Every single budget so far in the first term and the second term has been a long-term one, and there have been big ticket announcements outside of the budget. I think this...
There's also been a lot of tinkering during budgets as well.
Yeah. So I think this budget, purely from my own standpoint, if it gives us clarity of what the next 24 months will be as far as the government's spending priorities, its taxation priorities are concerned, that will give a lot of sense of what we can expect.
But also you've had successive quarters of slowing growth, barring the last few in 21-22. But if you go back to 2017, from 2017 onwards, from post-demonetization, we've struggled to get back to the kind of 7-8% growth that is necessary. What do you believe is necessary to do to get us back on that growth track?
So many things which were announced before the budget, the farm sector, the power distribution reforms, the labor codes which have, while they have been passed, have not been notified because of the fear of political backlash. I think there's already so much in the pipeline. The national asset monetization pipeline, Rajdeep, which was announced with so much fanfare. Air India disinvestment is a seminal moment in the last 30 years as far as why should the government be running airlines? That money will be saved. So I think there is much more even beyond the budget. That's why I said the next 24 months are very crucial politically, Rajdeep. If we get a sense of the direction, I think the markets and stakeholders in the economy will breathe a sigh of relief, and no unpleasant surprises, let me also add as the last point.
That's right. Sometimes in budgets, it's those unpleasant surprises that are more troubling than anything else. You want a budget that sets, as Siddharth rightly put, some kind of direction for the next 24 months for the government and the economy. As always, it's been educative to have fine minds discussing the economy on the show without the noise and offering their wisdom. All your suggestions, hopefully, some of them will be finding their way into Nirmala Sitharaman's budget. But for now, Ajit Ranade, Professor Arun Kumar, Siddharth Zarabi and Nilesh Shah, I appreciate your joining us on this budget roundtable. And you at home, stay well, stay safe, and let's hope that your wallet expands. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.